Welcome back, everybody. Once again, my name is Vernon Ware, and we are continuing our conversation on mental health, specifically talking about trauma. And today we're going to dig in a little bit deeper, and really we're going to talk about three different types of trauma. And those are acute trauma, those are chronic trauma, and complex trauma. Acute trauma is probably the one that we're most familiar with. Those are when you have either single or kind of individual events that happen to you that are traumatic. And so therefore that might be a car accident, that might be having someone try to create harm to you in some way, shape, or form. For some persons, that could be a really bad breakup. For some persons, that could be losing a job. But those are, in many cases, individual spaces that, in many cases, because we know that that's trauma, is something that we take care of. It's something that we can often get help and assistance for. And so acute trauma is a lot of times what we normally think of when we think of trauma. But then there's also chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is what happens when there is a cumulative or additive effect over time. It's something where in each individual situation, it may not necessarily rise to the level of trauma, but because of it happening over time, it rises to that level. Imagine if somebody on your job just called you terrible names, always messed with you, always picked on you. It could be a case where that happening one day or 2 days or a couple of days a week or a couple of days a month, let me say it that way, might be something that you could get past. But when it's happening week after week, month after month, year after year, then what happens is that actually becomes chronic. It can actually have the same type of trauma impacts on our life, even though each individual incident is not that way. It could be the way that we even talk to family members. Domestic violence obviously is one of those things that obviously falls into chronic trauma as well. And so therefore chronic trauma, which we're going to get into in a minute, is actually sometimes one of the ones that we least recognize, but unfortunately can be the most dangerous. And then the last is complex trauma. Complex trauma is normally trauma that is connected to someone else that is around you. It's in your proximity. So if we think about it, it may be the fact of if you deal with persons who have to go through a lot. Let's just say you're a first responder. You see trauma all the time, even if it's not necessarily your trauma. We know that unfortunately many times our teachers, they have to deal with trauma on a consistent basis. They're dealing with what may have happened in a child's home, what may be dealing and going on with their other persons around them, persons that are also on the staff. And matter of fact, even now, just having to deal with the complex trauma of wondering what may happen because of what has happened to other schools. And so therefore, any situation where the trauma may not necessarily touch you, but it is around you in some way or form, that is what we would call complex trauma. Now, we can spend all of our time on each and every one of these, but the one I want to deal with today most is the chronic trauma. And the reason for that is that on both acute trauma and on complex trauma, we acknowledge the fact that they are trauma. And so therefore we'll ask for help. If we've had a car accident, we'll take off work, we'll ask for help, we'll get what we need to be able to have that be dealt with. If we have to deal with, let's just say, something terrible or traumatic happens in the family, that might be complex trauma, but we will come together. Persons will wrap their arms around you. And so therefore in both of those cases, we recognize that it's trauma, and then often we're able to get assistance. Chronic trauma is unfortunately one that over time we can get to the point where we accept it just as part of life. If we think about it, there was a point in time, and unfortunately we're probably at that point in time now, where every time you would turn on the news, you would see or hear about a shooting. As a matter of fact, you would hear and see it so often that you could get to the point where you become what we would call numb to it. But you are still taking in that information. You are still feeling it. And so over time, even though your response to it may be muted, you are still feeling the trauma. If I were to tell you every single day, I never would, but if I were to tell you every single day, you're stupid, you're not going to amount to anything, you can never do anything right, each individual time of hearing that may not necessarily be traumatic. But if you've heard that day after day, week after week, month after month, then what happens is that becomes traumatic, but you also think of it as normal. And if you think of something as normal, you don't try to change it in any way, shape, or form. I would say that many times it's the chronic trauma in our life that can become the most dangerous, because we can have patterns, we can have routines that we constantly come into contact with those traumatic, really, instances. But because we're used to them, we then don't deal with it. We're used to the fact of somebody maybe calling us out our name. We're used to the fact of the job maybe treating us in a way that we don't want to be treated. We're unfortunately used to somebody that we love talking to us in a way that is not beneficial. We're even used to talking to ourselves in a way that is not beneficial, in a way that's not good for us. But because we're used to doing it, then it becomes part of our routine. And then it's that time after time after time that ends up having it be really a trauma that is chronic. Imagine it this way. If I gave you one little piece of rice, one grain of rice, that wouldn't have any weight to it at all. But if I have millions of those grains of rice and it's in a 100-pound bag, it would be incredibly hard to carry around. So what I really would ask all of us to do is, yes, make sure we take care of the acute traumas in our life, get the help that we need to be able to deal with those. Also watch some of the complex traumas. In some cases, and we'll talk about this next week, how we really can deal with the triggers attached to trauma. But in complex trauma, sometimes it may mean shifting who I'm around, shifting what conversations I'm in, even shifting what I look at in terms of social media so that I can make sure that I reduce how much complex trauma I am connected to. But the chronic trauma is really what I want you to focus on. And think about, in my weekly life, are there things that maybe individually are not devastating to me, but over time, with them happening again and again and again, has it been something that has impacted how I see the world? Has it been something that's impacted how I feel? What my emotions are about the world, about myself, about others? And has it even changed the way that I think and act? We look forward to seeing you next week as we talk about trauma triggers and how to deal with them.